It seems that every day we are reminded about the changing conditions of our home, planet Earth. Today's featured speaker is Tessa Code, a native of Seattle. Today, Tessa works for the U.S. Geological Survey in Magnuson Park. However, her experience includes a biological science technician for the National Park Service. Tessa earned her BS in biology from Santa Clara University. She has also worked on research projects in Australia, Hawaii, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and here in Washington State. Currently, Tessa studies fish populations with the Western Fisheries Research Center. She was also a member of NOAA, NOAA's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Marine Debris Mission to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands in 2018. Tessa and the team collected over 164,000 pounds of marine debris during that mission, ranging from plastic bottles to large fishing nets. Tessa is joined here today by her parents, Mary and Bob. Please give a warm Seattle 4 welcome to Tessa Code.
Good afternoon. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. My name is Tessa Code, and I'm honored to be able to present to you my talk, Fighting the Permanence of Plastic, a Pacific Islands Cleanup Story, with you today. Now, during this presentation, I will share my experience from the 2018 NOAA Marine Debris Mission, and throughout this presentation, you'll see a lot of beautiful photographs, and most of those were actually taken on the trip that I was on in 2018. So I hope that you enjoyed them. All right, let's see if this works. Yay, okay. A little about me. My name's Tessa. Like Kim said, I grew up here in Seattle and graduated from Santa Clara University. After I graduated with a BS in biology, I ended up working for the National Park Service in St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. And now when I was in the Caribbean, I started to notice just the overwhelming amount of single-use plastics and styrofoam that filled up garbage cans, was tossed out on the side of the road, and ultimately ended up in the ocean. And I started to feel like I was just a part of this big problem and like there wasn't a solution for it. So when the opportunity came up to work for the NOAA Marine Debris Program, I jumped at it to then start helping this problem instead of just sort of watching helplessly from the sideline. Now, as Kim mentioned, I don't actually work for NOAA anymore. I now work for USGS in Magnuson Park. But this experience with NOAA has really changed my outlook on plastics and the marine debris issue in general. So I can talk about marine debris for hours. My parents are in the audience, and they can definitely attest to that. So today, I'm really just going to stick with talking about the impact and the extent of marine debris, the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands in general, the NOAA Marine Debris Program, and the 2018 mission, which had two components: removing derelict fishing equipment from the water and removing shoreline plastics. And then I'm going to talk about how you can help. So marine debris is a phrase I'll be saying about 1 million times in the next 20 minutes, so I thought I should provide a definition. But basically, all this means is that these products are made of petroleum and they can never biodegrade. They can become invisible to the naked eye, but they will always be there. Since the 1950s, 8.3 billion tons of plastic has been created, and almost all of it still exists today. So today I'm going to be talking about two different kinds of marine debris: plastic fishing nets and larger plastic items. So these two types of marine debris have different impacts. Nets can entangle species as well as smother corals, which need the sunlight to survive, and it can also snap the coral structures. Now, hard plastics can be ingested by animals like seabirds, whales, sea turtles, and even fish. So you might be wondering, where are the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands? I certainly wondered that even when I got hired for this position. So the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are in the Hawaiian chain, but they're mostly made up of low-lying sand islands and really shallow coral reefs that extend past Kauai and Niihau. Now, why focus on the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands? There's marine debris pretty much everywhere. Why do we care about this specific location? Now, you have to know a little bit about ocean currents to understand that. In every ocean, there's a swirling There are swirling currents and prevailing winds that aggregate floating materials within the ocean. So this sort of swirling vortex also aggregates plastic, and we've named the Pacific gyre the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Now, this garbage patch is both the western and the eastern patches, and they're sort of connected by the subtropical convergence zone, which is where warm waters from the Indo-Pacific and cool Arctic waters meet, and they create kind of a highway that bridges these two big patches of garbage, and the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands are smack dab in the middle of that. Now, this area has a lot of estimates in terms of size. The most recent I heard was it's about 3 times the size of France, so we're talking a really expansive area. A lot of people have heard of the islands of plastic in the Pacific. This is kind of what they're talking about, although they don't actually look like islands. It's just a big mass of sometimes milky-looking water because plastic breaks down and becomes smaller and smaller, and it also aggregates large amounts of fishing nets in these areas. At last estimate, 46% of the marine debris in just the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is made of fishing equipment and gear that has either been abandoned or intentionally thrown in the ocean. So when wind and waves and hurricanes and everything push those areas of marine debris, these swirling areas of trash all around, they end up forcing them onto the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which then act as a comb and kind of filter all those things out. So you end up having a lot of garbage on these very isolated small islands. So the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands were actually designated as the Papahanaumokuakea National Monument in 2006, which is a very large mouthful. They were designated that because of their cultural and natural significance. They're home to 7,000 marine species, 25% of which only live on these islands. It also encapsulates 70% of coral reefs in U.S. jurisdiction, so there's a lot of coral there. And is very important to the Hawaiian culture as well. So the NOAA Marine Debris Program was actually established in 1996 in order to prevent entanglement hazards and protect this wildlife. One of the species it aims to protect is the Hawaiian monk seal, of which there are only 1,400 left in the world. 1,100 of those actually live in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And it's been estimated that 28 to 32% of these species are alive today because of marine debris removals, removal of entanglement hazards, and rehabilitation. Now, sea turtles are in a similar situation. If you've ever been to Maui and you've waved at a sea turtle underwater, it's most likely that that turtle will actually have to travel back up to the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands to lay her eggs. So they do migrate back up to those islands and can be entangled in fishing equipment. So since 1996 till 2018, the Marine Debris Program at NOAA has successfully removed over 2 million pounds of derelict fishing equipment from the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and they estimate that 52 metric tons of just nets washes up in those areas every single year. So the NOAA Marine Debris Mission in 2018 had 2 objectives. We were going to remove derelict fishing equipment, but also shoreline plastics from the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So we first stopped at Pearl and Hermes Atoll, which is right here. And it's a low-lying islands, but a lot of coral reef habitat. So we had 2 ways that we would survey these coral reefs. We would just swim along patch reefs, and we would also get towed behind boats in order to cover large expanses of sand to try to identify and remove nets. So when we found a net, it would oftentimes look like this. We would take a few elements of data, what the prevailing type of net was, how big it was, and then how much coral it seemed to damage. So after we got that data, some of the nets were actually so big that you could stand on top of them. So we're not talking one little net. I mean, these are massive conglomerates of nets. So after we got that data, we would work to detach them from the bottom. And although we were trained as NOAA divers for scuba tanks, we were a lot more streamlined if we were just free diving. So we removed all of these nets just using knives and breath hold diving. So we would get to work. Some of these nets were just 25 feet below the surface, so we would take buddy teams to try to detach all of them. And after we did, we would just use arm strength, the power of par buckling, and sheer determination to get them onto our boats. Sometimes we had to call other boats to help bring these thousands of pounds of nets on board, and it definitely gave us reason to celebrate when we were successful. So in just 10 operational days, we were able to remove 315 net clusters from Pearl and Hermes Atoll, which resulted in 51,504 pounds of derelict fishing equipment. So our next stop was to Midway, the place of the renowned Battle of Midway in 1942, and it's also the breeding grounds for over 2 million seabirds, 3 species of albatross. Our research goal there was to understand the accumulation rates of shoreline debris. So we already knew that 52 metric tons of nets washed up in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands per year, but that did not include shoreline plastics and single-use plastics and things that you think of like that. So like I mentioned earlier, hard plastics are ingested oftentimes by a lot of animals. This albatross chick was actually on Kure, and there were a few Nat Geo photographers there that were taking photos for a book that they were creating, and they saw this bird hatch, they saw it grow up a little bit, they saw it get sick, and they saw it die, and they ended up pulling those 212 pieces of plastic that you see on the screen just out of that one bird. And this is just an example of the situation of many seabirds out there. It's estimated that 90% of seabirds alive right now have plastic in their guts. So it's a huge, huge problem. So when we were on Midway, we continued to take nets out of the water and we cleaned up the shorelines. We also took some pretty sweet photos. And if you guys ever have the chance to go to Midway, please, please take it. If you ever as soon as you get on the island, you'll be given with a beach cruiser bicycle, which will be your main mode of transportation. And in 17 days, we gathered 63,240 pounds of shoreline plastics and derelict fishing equipment. Now, all of these nets that we picked up in Pearl and Hermes and at Midway were taken back and donated for the Energy from Nets program in Hawaii. They were incinerated, and they created enough electricity to power 28 homes for an entire year. So on our final leg of the journey, we kind of island hopped down Kure as the furthest tip of the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. We then hit Pearl and Hermes again to do just shoreline removals, Lisianski, Laysan, and French Frigate Shoals, and we were just removing shoreline plastics on this leg. So when you go to these places, again, they're the most isolated archipelago in the entire world. No one lives on these islands, and you expect them to look like this. Vast, expansive sandy beaches, lots of wildlife, no humans around, but when you get there, they actually look like this. They're covered in plastic, and you recognize quite a few of the containers. So it's absolutely everywhere. You can't step foot on these islands without seeing this type of plastic. Laundry baskets, fishing floats, I mean, you name it, it's there. One thing that you don't actually end up seeing are plastic bags and straws, and that's because those items are made of pretty thin plastic, and they would have already broken down into smaller microplastics by the time it would have taken them to get to these islands. So it's not that they're not out there in the ocean, they just break down a lot faster than a lot of these really hard plastics do. So while we were out there, we just got to work. We started picking up all of this plastic, and we picked up as much as we could in the time that we were on those islands before we had to move to the next. It was pretty backbreaking, I'll tell you that. It was a lot of trash, picking up of trash. And we had to get pretty creative in how we were going to carry this trash in very deep sand, during long times, and in really hot weather. So in 18 days, we removed 49,269 pounds of shoreline plastics. Now, this national monument is absolutely incredible. It's full of wildlife that doesn't usually see humans, so they act a little bit differently. They swim right by you without caring. They pose for your photos. Sometimes they want to swim with you because they just don't see humans all that often. and birds will take advantage of a new mode of transportation if given the opportunity. So what's so difficult when you go to these places and you know there's no humans is to see the evidence of humanity everywhere and the damage that we've caused. Now, while we were out there, we couldn't pick up all the shoreline plastics, and we were limiting ourselves to only retrieving the plastics that were bigger than the palm of our hand. If we tried to get all of the little microplastics on these beaches, I guarantee we would still be out there. So we would pick up things that we would recognize, like bottle caps or action figures, but everything else kind of had to stay if it was smaller than our hands. When we got back to Honolulu, we ended up inventorying everything that we picked up, putting them in piles, and getting the final counts. So we found you could really see what a lot of the materials out there were out there. We found a lot of fishing equipment, a lot of floats. Those little black tubes that you see are oyster spacers for oyster aquaculture. In the upper right-hand corner, you see eel cones, also used in the hagfish fishery, which we have in Washington. So this stuff is truly coming from everywhere. We also found a lot of household items. We found over 700 lighters, and we were only picking up lighters that were along the shoreline. There were much more on the inside of the islands, sort of inland from where we were. They were picked up by birds and fed to their chicks that ultimately perished. So there's a lot more out there. We just weren't including those in this study. And we gathered almost 3,000 shoes, almost 2,000 toothbrushes. It was really incredible, just the amount of items that we were able to pick up. We had over, I think it's 3,600 plastic bottles and plastic jugs, and the boat that they're in this photo is actually a boat that was sucked out after the 2011 tsunami hit in Japan, and we found this boat on Kure and brought it back to Honolulu. So in total, the 2018 mission removed 164,917 pounds of plastics. And from this experience, a lot of facts stuck with me. One being that recycling is not enough. I grew up on the mantra, reduce, reuse, recycle, which was great, but in our last Seattle Utilities pamphlet, they identified an avid recycling family in Seattle would still dispose of 300 pounds of plastic materials a year that couldn't be recycled. Now, recycling is great, but using less is better. So I would argue we need to add another R to our mantra. We need to refuse plastic, and then we need to reduce and reuse and recycle. And if you do that, Seattle Public Utilities estimates that your family will only dispose of 75 pounds annually of plastic packaging. So here are some ways that you can say goodbye to plastic in your life. You can change some daily habits. You can bring a reusable water bottle or a coffee mug, reusable grocery and produce bags. There are some really great ones that you can buy. To-go containers, and then the Seattle Public Utilities app actually has great ideas. And you know when you're looking at your recycling, you're saying, I think I can recycle this, and you kind of throw it in that container. Well, Seattle's been wishfully recycling for a long time, and in 2017, the rules got a lot stricter. So use the app, see what you actually can recycle. For instance, the disposable coffee cup lids, everything has to be at least 3 inches in diameter in order to recycle. So oftentimes those have to be thrown in the garbage. For instance, I always thought you could recycle them, but you can't. So some other things that you can do is substitute household products with sustainable alternatives. So I've just started using these toothpaste tablets. They're great for traveling. Also these silicone bags and a replacement for saran wrap. I've made my family switch exclusively to those. You can tell my parents I gave them to everyone for Christmas, so they had to. And one more thing about the toothbrushes. I always get my toothbrush from my dentist after my cleanings. I think we should all call our dentist after this and require those toothbrushes to be bamboo, because that would just already make a huge impact on the environment and the plastic that comes into the oceans. The third thing you can do is be a really good advocate as a consumer. There are a couple things like talk to your local grocery stores, advocate for more naked produce options. We don't need our bell peppers wrapped in plastic, we really don't. We can speak up at shareholder meetings if you have those connections with businesses, encourage companies to supply water coolers instead of water bottles, ask restaurants to adopt the offer first policy. Would you like a straw with that? Oftentimes people will say no. It's just straws are kind of forced upon us as a habit. And then eat sustainable seafood options. There are a lot of types of fish that are caught on long lines instead of large nets. So kind of choosing those options instead of large fisheries that require huge nets to capture them or fish aggregation devices would be a good way to try to curb the ghost fishing and the accrual of nets in the ocean. Some other options are signing up for subscription services. These items can come right to your door. Instead of buying that detergent at Safeway, you could get something that would come in a little tablet form that wouldn't have to use that single-use plastic, so you could get rid of that item. Eat sustainable seafood. Again, seafoodwatch.org has a great list of the types of fish that you can eat that are sustainable in your area, so that's really great. You can thrift. Just wear that jacket one more season than you were going to, and then thrift it away if it doesn't match any of your outfits. We need to keep reusing our items as much as possible. Buy in bulk. You can read blogs. The blogs are actually really good. They give you some great ideas on how to reduce your plastic use every day. And vote for increased legislation to reduce single-use plastics, but also to introduce fishing regulations that decrease the number of abandoned nets at sea. You can donate to some of these. These are just examples of companies that are trying to gather up the marine debris that's already out there. Some are doing big beach cleanups. Others are actively trying to decrease the size of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And it's just one straw. It's something that I've said a couple times to myself. But when you think about it in the scope of 7 billion people saying it, this seemingly small choice becomes a much bigger one. And we need to really start thinking of plastic as permanent because actually we only use those single-use plastic items for approximately 20 minutes before we throw them out. And there really is no such thing as throwing something away anymore. It goes somewhere and it's pretty much here forever. So we don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. So when I got back from this mission, I just looked around my house to see what types of plastic I was using, and I've been trying to look for alternatives ever since. A great metaphor that I've heard that's really stuck with me just about this issue is that if you came home and your bathtub was overflowing and your bathroom was completely sopping wet, would you grab the mop first or would you turn off the faucet to fix your problem? We need to turn off the faucet of single-use plastics because marine debris is truly everyone's problem. Thank you very much. I do have some time for questions, if anyone has any. How do we do this with the microphone situation?
What was the one?
Yeah. Oh.
I'll ask one.
Sure.
So one of the points that people who are a little negative about recycling make is that, well, straws are such a small proportion. And anyway, the United States doesn't contribute but a small percentage of the plastic waste in the world. Most of it comes from Asia and that region. What is the way forward in those environments, and how do you answer the plastic straw criticism?
Right. So it's a very good question. There are a lot of plastic does come out of Asia. However, the United States was sending our recycling to Asia for quite a long time, and the recycling plants were unregulated there. We don't know where that plastic went. So although maybe that was the most immediate land source, we absolutely contributed to that problem. Plastic straws, by the way, according to the Seattle Public Utility app, cannot be recycled. So we just need to remove plastic straws from our vocabulary at this point, I would say. And we live in a great area. Seattle has, the biggest recycling facility that I've ever heard of in the country, but we still need to get rid of that idea, oh, it's okay, I'm just gonna recycle it, because we need to curb the manufacturing of plastic sort of at the source. And we should also establish a really good guideline sort of for the rest of the world to follow. So I guess I don't have any hard and fast answers for you, but it really is. I found a cattle tag from California out there. I saw a lot of Coca-Cola products. Maybe if these products aren't just manufactured in or, manufactured or used in Asia, they still are possibly US companies. So we still can inflict a lot of change. Thanks. Yes.
Do you know the overall cost of the project to remove all that?
Ooh, that's a great question, and it's a really large number. I hesitate to give you a value because it will probably be wrong. But the NOAA Marine Debris Program is funded in a couple of ways. Number one, it's funded by that national monument because they have to get people out there to remove those entanglement hazards for the endangered species that live in those waters. In addition, there have been some other funding sources using some nonprofits as well that can help work through that. And then the Friends of the National Wildlife Foundation also donate money. But even just staying on the NOAA ship is pricey, which is why this program unfortunately can't happen every year, even though all of the data really points to it having to happen annually because so many items accrue in this area. So, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. It's really excellent.
Thanks.
When you were in the islands, picking stuff up off the beach, particularly the nets, can you determine where they came from, what fishing organizations might have been involved, and if you could, what kind of enforcement mechanism might exist?
It's a great question. So the reason why we were taking that data for the nets is to try to determine where they came from. Maybe there's a specific night or kind of net that comes from a certain place. At this point, we don't know. There are a couple graduate programs happening right now trying to figure that out. And there have been some finger pointing at a couple types of fisheries that use fish aggregation devices in order to easily fish out for tuna and other types of seafood that typically they'd have to sort of go around and try to find the school. They create sort of a floating island of nets. The fish aggregate under it. They fish out all those fish. They cut the floats off the nets and they let the net just drift away. So if as a consumer, I just avoid those fisheries. Those are unsustainable fisheries. They're using unsustainable practices. So that's how I'm trying to fight it from my position. When we do figure out where exactly those nets are coming from or what fisheries that absolutely is, I would argue that there need to be some more regulations for the retrieval of nets. You can put little acoustic tags on your net so that if it does become detached or abandoned, you can then re-find it a lot easier. You should also have to put some sort of identifier on the net, so if it's found, you can then be fined afterwards. We just need a little bit more incentive, whether it's from the government or from the fishermen themselves, for people to have ownership of these fishing devices and equipment. Thanks. Sure.
I just want to thank you earnestly for the work that you did and the mission that you're sharing with our audience and hopefully with others. I think it's great, your message associated with everyone taking individual responsibility. The question I have for you is, in Asia Pacific, a lot of that activity, especially in developing countries, is driven by the economics. Have you heard anything about trying to go upstream on the economics of plastic in emerging countries and how that can be arrested? Because until we can address the whole spectrum, we're going to be under a lot of pressure. Thank you so much.
That is a tough question and just a little out of my wheelhouse. But I would say that there are a lot of plastics coming out of Asia. That doesn't absolve us from limiting our plastic use. But there are emerging companies and businesses that are trying to curb the flow of plastics, even in developing countries. One of and my personal experience with that is when I was in the Caribbean, we experienced 2 massive hurricanes, and I realized with incoming aid, the amounts of single-use plastics just skyrocketed. I mean, everyone was drinking out of bottled water. All of the food came in, like, I lived off MREs for a while. If you've ever had them, they're disgusting, but they're very high calorie, and all of those came wrapped in plastic. So that it's almost because that's the only pathway we have, and I think that that's sort of how emerging countries are using plastics. I would say that we should develop other ways, and I don't have the exact answer for you there, but I do think that there's hope. Okay. I think one more question.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your
Great.
presentation. My question is, when you assessed your apartment and you looked at what you can now replace, do you feel or do you know, is there a capability of getting more biodegradable items in our lifestyle that can totally get the reduce of plastic use? And does that exist within our capabilities? Is that technology right now?
Yeah, I think that technology does exist. Typically, when I look around my house and I try to get rid of the single-use plastics, it's like the dishwasher soap and the detergent and all of those things. And now that there are options where they can send you tablets, those can dissolve into the water in your permanent container that you have. So you get rid of that use for the plastic that's just carrying the liquid that you can kind of create yourself. In terms of biodegradable options, I've heard of a lot of promise. Utensils being made of sort of coconut husks is one, and then certain types of seaweed as well. But there's those starch compostable options right now, which are great if they actually get composted, put into the municipal compost. But if you go to a place that doesn't have municipal compost, it's just going into the landfill and it will not be, it won't biodegrade. So it's a little bit of false advertising there. I think it just, putting your money where your mouth is in terms of what products you're going to buy, but they do exist, and I think that they're becoming more and more prevalent as this topic gets discussed. One more thing sorry, I know I'm over time. One more thing that I would love to encourage you all to do is talk about this issue with people that you know. Honestly, before I was on this program, I didn't realize how many nets were floating in the ocean. This is a huge issue that no one knows about, and I think that we can really make a positive impact. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening.